Have you ever looked at someone who seemed completely ordinary and unconsciously thought that they didn't belong where you were standing? That day, on a military base, a young soldier laughed at an older man wearing a worn flannel shirt. No one knew that just a few minutes later the entire space would fall silent, not because of an order, but because of a truth no one was ready to face. That morning, at the military base's historical exhibition, it unfolded like any other open house event. There were no alarm sirens, no commands cutting through the air. Only the laughter of children, the lively footsteps of families coming to visit, and old stories retold in the low, steady voices of veterans long past their prime. Amid this seemingly ordinary scene, a young soldier stood guard near the entrance. His name was Ryan, 22 years old. He had graduated from advanced training less than a year earlier. The uniform on Ryan's body still carried the scent of new fabric. His boots were polished so well that they reflected the morning sunlight. He stood straight, chin slightly raised, not out of arrogance, but because of a belief widespread among those newly clad in uniform, that they represent order, that their duty is to protect what is by the book. In front of Ryan, slightly off to the side, an older man sat on a worn folding chair. He wore a gray flannel shirt frayed at the cuffs and jeans faded with time. No insignia, no rank. He looked more like a grandfather you might find in a small roadside cafe than someone who belonged on a military base. Ryan looked at him, then glanced back at the sign that read, "Area reserved for military personnel and families." In Ryan's mind, everything seemed very clear. This man did not belong here. Maybe he had wandered into the wrong place. Perhaps he was just a curious civilian. Or worse, a disruptive presence in a space Ryan believed it was his responsibility to protect. The older man did nothing. He didn't look around. He didn't ask questions. He didn't explain himself. He sat there, both hands resting lightly on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, as if he were listening to something no one else around could hear. That silence did not put Ryan at ease. It unsettled him. And in that moment, Ryan took a step forward, not with the intention to cause harm, but with the belief that he was doing the right thing. He did not know that this single step had unknowingly brought him into contact with a story far greater than his youth, the regulations, or even the uniform he was wearing. Ryan stopped in front of the older man, standing close enough that his shadow fell over the faded, worn shoes. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain the stern expression he believed the situation required. "Sir," Ryan said, "this area is restricted to military personnel and their families. May I see your identification?" Taken on its own, the sentence might not have sounded malicious, but the tone was different. It carried impatience, an unspoken assertion that the person in front of him was in the wrong place. The older man slowly turned his head. Not the hurried turn of someone who had been caught, but a calm, deliberate movement, as if he had heard the words long ago and had only now decided to respond. He did not speak right away. That silence made Ryan feel challenged. And when people are still very young, they often mistake silence for defiance. "Did you hear me?" Ryan raised his voice slightly. A few young soldiers standing nearby began to take notice. A soft laugh slipped out, quick, then gone. The older man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old leather wallet. The leather was cracked. The corners are worn smooth from years of use. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the long passage of time. Ryan sighed. "Could you hurry it up?" Finally, the card was handed over. Ryan took it, skimmed the name and address, then frowned faintly. "You don't have a base access card," he said. "That means you're not authorized to be here." He was about to hand the card back when his eyes suddenly stopped. On the collar of that old flannel shirt was a small pin, bent, dull, so easy to miss unless one looked closely. Ryan pointed at it. "What's that supposed to be?" Without waiting for an answer, he laughed. "A souvenir? Or some award from a senior center?" This time, the laughter behind him was no longer isolated. It spread, dry and uncomfortable, causing a few people in the crowd to turn away. The older man still did not respond. He lowered his eyes to the pin, ever so slightly. In that moment, no one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. What was happening was no longer a security check. It was humiliation, wrapped in the appearance of authority. And Ryan, wearing his spotless new uniform, still believed he was doing the right thing. He did not know that this tiny detail, that worn, insignificant pin, was a doorway to a truth that no amount of laughter could ever conceal. As the laughter still hung in the air, the older man gently lowered his head. Not out of shame, but because his eyes had just fallen upon the small pin on his collar, something that had been there for decades, quiet and unassuming, just like the man himself. In that moment, the exhibition tent disappeared. There was no more morning sunlight, no children's voices, no immature laughter from moments before. Instead, there was cold. A cold that cut into the flesh so deep that every breath felt like swallowing shards of broken ice. Before his eyes was no longer the concrete floor of the military base, but a mountainside blanketed in white snow, barren, endless. He was young again, only 20 years old. The wind screamed through the rock crevices, carrying the smell of gunpowder and burned metal. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, not in relentless barrages, but in scattered echoes, just enough to remind him that death was still waiting patiently. He knelt beside his commanding officer, a man far younger than the older man standing there now. The officer was struggling to breathe. Each breath was a battle. Blood soaked through the heavy clothing, freezing into dark patches. He tried to hold the officer's hand, but it grew colder. In a haze, the man used the last of his strength to pull out a twisted piece of metal, the remaining fragment of a radio destroyed in the fighting. He watched as the trembling hand pressed the metal into his own palm. "Don't let them forget." The voice was very soft, almost a breath. There was no ceremony, no formation, no medals, only a message entrusted in silence, and one survivor, forced to carry that memory for the rest of his life. The memory slowly faded. The tent came back into view. Voices, light, warm air. The older man blinked. The pin was still there. Not bright, not beautiful, but heavier than any piece of metal ever pinned to a uniform. And while Ryan still stood before him, believing he was facing a lost older man. The older man understood perfectly well. There are some battles that never truly end. They change their form in silence and wait to be remembered. Not everyone inside the tent was laughing. At the edge of the exhibition area, Sergeant First Class Ruiz stood still, his arms folded across his chest. He did not intervene. Not yet. But his eyes never left the older man and the young soldier who faced each other. Ruiz had been in the military long enough to understand one thing. Real danger does not always come from what is loud. It comes from what is too quiet. He watched the way the older man slowly stood up, not the hesitation of someone afraid, but the economy of movement of a body shaped by experience. Not a single wasted gesture, not a single defensive reflex. That look, Ruiz had seen it before. Not in new soldiers, but in those who had been through too much to need still to prove anything. Ruiz also watched Ryan, a young soldier standing very straight, too straight. His voice was louder than necessary, every word carefully asserting, "I am in control of this situation." But Ruiz knew, when someone has to keep proving their authority. That is, when that authority is at its most fragile. Then his gaze settled on the pin. It did not resemble any official insignia, no serial number, no unit marking, no sense of ceremony. Yet Ruiz felt a weight settle in his chest. He had seen things like this before. Objects that did not exist in any regulation. Items are kept for reasons that could never be written into a report. A chill ran up his spine, the kind only those who had stood on the edge between life and death could recognize. Something was very wrong here. Ruiz did not raise his voice. He did not issue an order. He did not escalate the situation. He stepped back slightly and pulled out his phone as if merely checking a message. When he spoke to headquarters, his voice was low, steady. "This is SFC Ruiz? I need to verify an individual named Callahan. I think we should take a closer look." When he ended the call, the situation in front of him looked unchanged. Ryan continued questioning. The older man remained silent. But Ruiz knew that from the moment that call ended, the gears of a much larger system had begun to turn. And whether Ryan realized it or not, the time of blind confidence was running out. Ryan felt that he was in control. The older man did not resist. The crowd did not intervene. The senior officer from earlier had also stepped back. In Ryan's mind, all of it reinforced a single thought. "I'm doing the right thing." "Sir," Ryan said, his voice slowing, carrying a performative tone of concern, "for your safety and the safety of those around you, I'm required to keep you here until the military police arrive." He extended his hand, not touching, but close enough to intrude upon the older man's personal space. And at that exact moment, a sound tore through the air. Not a voice, not a command. A siren. At first distant, then rapidly approaching. Not one vehicle, not two, an entire convoy. The tent, moments ago full of noise, suddenly fell into an unnatural silence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes turned in unison toward the entrance. Ryan froze. His hand still hovered in the air. The tent flap burst open. 2 military police officers entered first, taking positions on either side, posture rigid. They did not look at Ryan. They did not look at the older man. They stared straight ahead. Then another man stepped inside. No introduction needed, no announcement required. The way he walked, slow, deliberate, was enough for everyone to understand. Absolute authority had just arrived. The base commander. He did not pause to assess the situation. He did not ask questions. He did not look for someone to blame. He walked straight through the crowd, which instinctively parted to either side as he moved toward the folding chair where the older man was rising with the slowness of age. Ryan stepped back half a pace on instinct. For the first time since the incident began, he did not know what to do. The commander stopped a few steps in front of the older man. In that moment, the entire tent seemed to hold its breath. Then he straightened, raised his hand, and saluted. A precise, decisive salute without excess, a salute reserved for those who had paid with their entire lives. "It is an honor to welcome you," he said, his voice low and clear. No one said anything else, because by then, everyone understood. The truth had arrived, and no one could laugh anymore. The commander remained in his salute. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The older man stood there, his back slightly bent with age, his hands resting lightly in front of his abdomen. His gaze did not waver. There was no surprise in his eyes. It seemed that this moment, he had witnessed it somewhere in the past, just a very long time ago. "First Sergeant Callahan," the commander spoke. "It is a great honor for this base to welcome you here." The words were not loud, but they were enough to shatter the picture Ryan had built in his mind entirely. First Sergeant? Ryan stood frozen. His throat went dry. A ringing filled his ears, as if every sound around him had been drained away. The commander turned slightly, facing the breathless crowd. "Perhaps not everyone here knows," he said slowly, each word chosen with care. "But the man you just saw being questioned has served this country longer than the age of many people in this tent." He paused, long enough for the meaning to sink in. 3 wars, 3 generations of soldiers, and one battle that military history still speaks of to this day. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd. The commander continued, not with dramatics, but with the reverence of someone who understood the cost behind every word. About a snow-covered mountainside, about hours without reinforcements, about a soldier who held his position when every route of retreat had been cut off. When others could not go on, he said, he stayed. And then came the sentence that collapsed the entire space into absolute silence. He is a recipient of the Medal of Honor. No one applauded. No one whispered. Veterans rose to their feet without being ordered. The young lowered their heads without being told. Ryan felt his legs begin to tremble. Every word he had spoken earlier, every laugh, every gesture, now came crashing back like a heavy wave pressing against his chest. He looked at the small pin on the older man's collar once more. This time he did not see a worn trinket. He saw a promise kept for an entire lifetime. And in that moment, Ryan understood something no textbook could ever teach. Some people do not need a uniform to remind them to stand at attention. The silence stretched on for several more seconds. No one dared to move. No one dared to look directly at Ryan. The commander slowly lowered his salute. His gaze shifted, no longer carrying the reverence reserved for a hero, but the direct, chilling clarity reserved for an undeniable mistake. "Ryan," he said, his voice low and steady, "do you know why this uniform exists?" Ryan did not answer. Not out of defiance, but because, in his mind, every justification had become meaningless. "Because there are people who stood in places we cannot even imagine," the commander continued, "and they paid the price so that today we can stand here, in safety." He paused. Nothing more needed to be said. Ryan lowered his head. For the first time since he had put on that uniform, he felt how heavy it truly was. Not because of responsibility, but because he had not yet earned it. The commander turned toward the subordinate officers as if preparing to issue a final decision. All eyes shifted to Ryan, and then a slow voice spoke. "Sir?" The older man took a tiny step forward. No one urged him on. No one stopped him. "He's young," the old man said, his voice not loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. "We were young once, too." Ryan looked up, stunned. The older man met his eyes, not with blame, not with anger, but with a look deeply familiar. The look of those who have lived through mistakes and understand that a person should not be defined by their worst moment. "Punishment may make someone afraid," he continued, "but only learning makes them change." No one spoke. The commander looked at the older man for a long moment. In his eyes was no longer simple respect, but deep understanding. He nodded slowly. "As you wish," he said. "He will be taught." Ryan felt his throat tighten, not because he had escaped punishment, but because for the first time in his life, he had been given the chance to become a better person, rather than being condemned as a bad one. And in that moment, Ryan understood something. The greatest strength of truly great people does not lie in their ability to bring others down, but in their choice not to. Ryan was not discharged from the military. There was no gavel of judgment, no public disciplinary announcement, only a quiet decision and a longer, more challenging road. The next day, Ryan was reassigned from his old unit. No farewell ceremony, no looks of regret. He began a special training program, one without a drill field, without shouted commands, and without the rhythmic stomp of boots. Instead, there was silence. In the mornings, he sat in the base library, in front of thick books that smelled of old paper. Pages that told of battles, not through heroics, but through casualty numbers, flawed decisions, and names that never returned. In the afternoons, Ryan cleaned each display case in the museum. He read every line of every placard, studied every black and white photograph. Faces so young, eyes so old. In the evenings, he was required to write, not reports, but reflections. To write about those who had gone before him, to write about what made them symbols, even though they had never sought to be. At first, Ryan's writing was dry, like a task to be completed, but over time his pace slowed, sentences grew longer, and silences appeared between the lines. For the first time, Ryan realized that history is not something to be admired from a distance. It demands responsibility from those who inherit it. Several months later, on a quiet afternoon, Ryan went to a local veterans hall. No uniform, no rank, just a young man standing at the door, hesitating for a long time before knocking. The older man looked up at the sound. His eyes were as calm as they had been that day. "I'm sorry," Ryan said. His voice did not tremble, but it was sincere. The older man studied him for a moment, then he pulled out a chair. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me, what have you learned?" And in that moment, Ryan understood. The most significant lesson does not live in books, but in having the courage to return to the place where you were once wrong, as a different person. The story ended on that quiet afternoon. An older man, a young man, two chairs facing each other in the small room of a veterans hall. But there are things which, once seen, can never return to how they were before. A few weeks later, the military base where everything had begun enacted a quiet change. No fanfare, no press release, just a single added line in the training program. Every new service member would spend time meeting with local veterans, not to listen to lectures, but to listen to stories. They called it the Callahan Initiative. No one said it was a punishment. No one called it a reward either. It was simply a reminder that a uniform does not begin on the day it is issued, but with the people who once wore it, and then took it off forever. Ryan was among the first to volunteer for the program. He spoke less now. He no longer walked as if trying to prove something. He learned how to stand still and listen, to names that never appeared on monuments, to decisions with no clear right or wrong, to long nights when the only thing that kept people going was responsibility to the person beside them. The older man continued to visit the base on days when the sunlight was gentle, the same old flannel shirt, the same small pin on his collar. No one asked him to stand up and tell stories. He never volunteered to. But whenever he appeared, the young automatically lowered their voices, not out of fear, but because they had learned how to recognize the presence of history. Once, as Ryan walked him out to the parking lot, he asked quietly, "Why have you never taken that pin off?" The older man smiled, very faintly. "Because there are some things that don't need to be seen," he said. "But if I take it off, I might forget why I survived." Ryan said nothing more, and in that moment, he understood. True legacy does not lie in what is recorded, but in the people who change the way they see the world, simply because a story was told at the right time. This story does not end with a verdict, nor does it close with applause or stage lights. It ends in silence. A silence very different from the one at the beginning, no longer tense, no longer built on misunderstanding, but the silence of people who have just realized that they had been looking at the world too quickly. The older man leaves the base the same way he arrived. No escort, no ceremonial display, just a slow-moving figure carrying a small, tarnished pin and an entire piece of history that not everyone has the patience to listen to. Ryan stands there watching for a long time. This time, he is not looking with the eyes of someone enforcing rules. He is looking with the eyes of a person who has just learned the most important lesson of his life, that respect does not come from rank, but from understanding whose shoulders you are standing on. Perhaps somewhere out there, you have been like Ryan too, quick to judge, quick to believe that someone who seems ordinary has nothing worth hearing. But life always finds a way to remind us that the quietest people, they are often the ones who have weathered the fiercest storms. And sometimes all it takes is slowing down by a single beat, lowering your voice just a little, looking one more time, to realize that history is sitting right in front of you. If this story made you pause for a few seconds and think differently about a stranger, leave a comment. Share this story with someone you value. And if you believe that stories about life, memory, and quiet awakenings deserve to be told more often, walk with deep life tales. We do not tell stories to judge. We tell them to remember what once truly mattered. See you in the following story.